Welcome back. Today we're exploring a chilling case that shook the peaceful town of Derry, New Hampshire in 1990. As one witness in the trial would later say, "I never believed that someone so young could be convinced to take a man's life. But here we are, living with that terrible truth." This statement, delivered by a stunned neighbor who had taken the witness stand during the intense legal proceedings, encapsulates the horrifying blend of betrayal, manipulation, and heartbreak at the center of this story. This was not a case of random violence or a robbery gone wrong. Instead, it involved a secret affair, a charismatic yet cunning figure who pulled the strings, and a vulnerable teenager bent to another's will. The murder of 24-year-old Gregg Smart, carried out by Billy Flynn, a teenager who claimed he was pressed into the act by his lover, Pamela Smart, sent ripples of fear, confusion, and outrage across the community. It ignited the national media's interest, who descended upon Derry and splashed the story across front pages and nightly newscasts. In the days that followed the murder, the townspeople gathered outside the Smart residence, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Gregg's funeral took place under a warm May sun, with friends, co-workers, and neighbors crowding into the local funeral home. Many arrived early, well before the scheduled service time. Some lingered on the sidewalk, heads bowed, trying to make sense of the sudden and brutal act that had robbed a young man of his future. Derry, a place where people often left their doors unlocked and knew each other by first name, felt somehow darker and less familiar. Every detail of the crime reverberated through the community. Shock gave way to anger and suspicion, and no one seemed able to step outside the gravitational pull of the case. The revelation that the perpetrators were children, potentially old enough to drive, only heightened the tension. Teachers whispered to one another in school hallways. Parents monitored their children's friendships more closely. There were candlelight vigils near the town square, and prayer services at local churches. The local newspaper, the Derry News, reported that calls and letters poured in daily, some from as far away as California, offering condolences or demanding answers. The entire community was left grappling with the question, how could something like this happen here? On that spring morning in 1990, Gregg Smart was just another young man in a small New England town, running errands, making plans for the future, unaware that his life's final chapter would unfold later that evening in the quiet corridors of his own home. By the time the police were called and the sirens cut through the night air, it would be too late. The world, it seemed, had changed in the blink of an eye, and the story that would come to light, a narrative of seduction, manipulation, and murder, was one that would remain etched in the collective memory of the town long after the trial ended and the courtroom emptied. The victim in this tragic story was Gregg Smart, born Gregory William Smart, just 24 years old at the time of his murder. Gregg was the middle child of 3 siblings, raised in a stable, loving household. The family was close kin. His parents, John and Judith, owned a modest home in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, where Gregg spent most of his childhood before he moved to New Hampshire as a young adult. Family gatherings were common, with potluck-style dinners and board games that frequently devolved into friendly laughter and banter. Gregg's upbringing was secure and nurturing. It instilled in him a kind of easygoing nature and a readiness to find the good in others. After graduating from high school, he moved north, to Derry, where he found a job with a local insurance company. He quickly developed a reputation as a reliable, hard-working professional who brought a calm energy to the office. Co-workers mentioned he was the type who never missed a deadline, often staying late to finish tasks so that he wouldn't burden anyone else. Outside the office, Gregg led a fairly routine life. He enjoyed photography, an interest that started when he received a camera as a high school graduation gift. He loved heading out on weekends, camera slung around his neck, snapping pictures of old New England barns or capturing the subtle changes of the seasons. Another passion was music. In high school, he had fronted a small rock band with friends. While he no longer performed regularly, he could still be found tinkering with his guitar at home, playing classic rock riffs or buying tickets to concerts whenever a favorite band toured nearby. During his lunch breaks, he sometimes browsed local record shops, chatting amiably with store clerks about new album releases. His teachers from high school recalled that Gregg was never the star student who grabbed the spotlight, but he was a steady, kind presence in the classroom. He treated everyone equally, never excluding anyone from group activities. Friends remember him as open-hearted, a guy who'd give you a ride in the rain without a second thought, or lend you $20 if you were short on lunch money. Though not a standout athlete, he played on the school's intramural teams, enjoying the camaraderie more than the competition. Photographs show him smiling broadly, arms slung over a friend's shoulder. There are a few surviving videos: a 1988 backyard barbecue, filmed by a friend, where Gregg flips hamburgers and teases his brother about a bad haircut. These glimpses of his life, pre-tragedy, paint a portrait of a man who had a gentle humor and a zest for simple pleasures. In the months leading up to his death, Gregg often spoke about wanting to settle down and start a family. He had married Pamela, a bright, attractive woman he'd met while working in media events, and he was thrilled at the prospect of building a life with her. They lived in a modest condo, working toward bigger dreams: a house, maybe children one day, trips overseas. Gregg daydreamed about traveling to Europe, exploring castles in England, or sampling wine in Italy. He wanted stability, a good life, filled with love, good friends, and meaningful experiences. Gregg's last known normal day was May 1, 1990. According to colleagues, he worked until about 5 p.m., called a client, typed out a report, and tidied his desk before leaving. Security cameras at the insurance agency show him smiling and chatting briefly with a coworker in the corridor before he headed out. That evening the weather was mild, the kind of early spring day where the scent of blooming flowers drifted through open windows. He probably had dinner plans with his wife, maybe intended to watch a little TV or flip through a magazine. The next morning friends would recall seeing him a few days prior, noting nothing out of the ordinary. It's tragic to consider how close Gregg was to a future he would never see, how quickly everything would be taken away. Derry, the setting for this tragedy, was a small but steadily growing town in southern New Hampshire, with a population hovering around 300 at the time. It struck a balance between suburban comfort and rural charm. The place had once been best known for its links to the poet Robert Frost, who had lived on a nearby farm. Visitors would sometimes stop to take in the historical markers, snapping photographs of the old homesteads and scenic rolling fields. Along the main streets one would find a scattering of local businesses: a family-owned bakery, a few hardware stores, a diner that had been around since the 1950s, serving fluffy pancakes and strong coffee. It was the kind of town where people nodded hello to strangers, and where high school sports events still drew crowds. At the center of Derry were a few key landmarks: the municipal building, the old opera house converted into a community theater, and a public library with a beautiful brick facade dating back to the early 20th century. These landmarks, though modest, created a sense of place and continuity. The Smart condo was located in a reasonably quiet part of town, not too far from a small shopping center, and close to the main road leading toward Interstate 93. The neighborhoods were neatly arranged, houses painted in pastel hues, front lawns trimmed, and American flags waving in the breeze. The crime scene, a simple, unassuming condo, contrasted sharply with the tranquility that surrounded it. The weather leading up to that fateful May day had been mild and pleasant, with occasional patches of rain giving way to sunshine. By 7 p.m. on May 1, 1990, the temperature hovered around the mid-50s Fahrenheit, and the skies were mostly clear. Map-wise, Derry sits in Rockingham County, not far from the Massachusetts border. This proximity to larger cities meant residents could commute to work or venture out for entertainment, yet still return home to a quieter environment in the evenings. Before the murder, Derry's crime rate was relatively low, mostly small infractions. Violent crime was rare, and certainly not something involving a calculated plot, like the one that would soon be uncovered. When Gregg's murder hit the headlines, the local community felt as if their cherished sense of security had been ripped away overnight. The tragedy, occurring in a seemingly average neighborhood, sparked fear. If this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Derry's residents found themselves scrutinizing every detail. Who were these people? Why did this happen? The local landmarks took on a darker cast as reporters descended, vans parked near the crime scene, and camera crews set up on sidewalks previously used for children's hopscotch games. In time, everyone would remember exactly where they were when they heard about Gregg Smart's death. At the heart of all this stood the Smart family, and the network of relationships that had shaped Gregg's short life. Gregg came from a family of 5. There were his parents, John and Judith, both hard-working individuals who instilled in their children the value of honesty and integrity. John had worked for a manufacturing company for decades. Judith ran a small home business, selling craft items. They were not wealthy by any means, but they got by comfortably, providing for their 3 children and giving them the tools to succeed. Gregg's older brother Joseph was a couple of years Gregg's senior, already married and living in Massachusetts. His younger sister Andrea was finishing her college education, considering a career in education. Gregg spoke to his siblings often, sometimes calling just to chat about nothing in particular. The 3 siblings visited each other for holidays, birthdays, and the occasional weekend barbecue. Within the Smart family, affection was not just expressed verbally, but through acts of kindness, helping one another move to new apartments, cooking meals, lending money if needed. Gregg's relationship with his parents remained close even after he moved to Derry. He would drive down to Massachusetts once a month or so, sharing Sunday dinner. His father remembered Gregg's eagerness to settle into a stable adult life. He was proud that Gregg had found a steady job in insurance, a secure and respectable profession. His mother, who had a knack for reading people, always said Gregg was a gentle soul. In letters saved by the family, Gregg wrote about making plans for the future, improving his photography skills, maybe even turning it into a side business one day. He met Pamela Smart through a mutual acquaintance at a New Year's Eve party a couple of years before the murder. Pamela, originally from Florida, had a bright smile and big ambitions. They married in 1989, excitedly making their way in life as newlyweds. The wedding was a modest affair. Family and close friends gathered in a local hall, sharing laughter and dancing to a small hired band. Photographs show Gregg laughing, holding Pamela's hand, looking forward to the life ahead of them. Inside the Smart home, daily routines were not too different from any working couple in their 20s. Gregg would wake early, often around 6:30 a.m., shower, and head out to the insurance office. Pamela worked as a media coordinator at a local high school. By evening, they would reconvene, share a meal at their small dining table, and sometimes watch TV or go out for ice cream if the weather was good. On weekends, Gregg might mow the lawn or wash the car, while Pamela caught up on grading student work or planning events at school. They had recently hosted Easter brunch for Gregg's parents, an event now immortalized in family photographs showing Gregg carving a ham, smiling as his father teased him about his cooking skills. Prior to Gregg's death, there were no major family traumas or conflicts that outsiders knew of. On the surface, all seemed well. They were seen as a nice, normal couple on the rise. The family's economic situation was solid, not extravagant. Everyone in the Smart circle seemed to get along. The family held a decent standing in the community. Decent, that is, until the tragedy that changed everything. After Gregg's murder, family members found themselves under the harsh glare of national media attention. They struggled with grief, trying to remember the good times, clinging to the hope that justice would be served. The anger and disbelief they felt, knowing Gregg's life was cut short in his own home, weighed heavily on them. Every photograph taken before May 1, 1990, was now a reminder of what the world had lost. In the weeks leading up to the crime, the town went about its business as usual. Gregg's last known normal day followed a pattern: wake early, head to work, and return home in the evening. Witnesses saw him at the office on May 1, 1990, diligently finishing paperwork and chatting amiably with coworkers. Phone records show Gregg placed a call at 4:45 p.m. to confirm a client meeting later that week. Nothing in his tone or behavior suggested any unease or concern. Security cameras in the building's lobby captured Gregg leaving at 5:02 p.m., dressed in a casual sports jacket, a small smile on his face as he exchanged a last word with a colleague. During the day leading up to the murder, it had been partly cloudy with temperatures in the low 60s. Derry's streets were calm, children playing after school, neighbors watering their lawns. Gregg's neighbor Susan Murphy testified later that she saw Gregg's car pull into the driveway around 5:30 p.m. She waved, and he waved back, a gesture so routine it barely registered at the time. Another neighbor, who later gave a statement to the police, recalled seeing Gregg bring in the mail, then disappear into his home. By all accounts, Gregg was expecting a quiet evening. That same day, unbeknownst to Gregg, events were in motion that would lead to his death. His wife, Pamela Smart, was allegedly involved in secret communications with her teenage lover, William Flynn. Phone records later introduced in court showed Pamela making calls to a known associate of Flynn's. Pieces of the timeline came together during the investigation. On April 30 and May 1, calls pinged between Pamela's home number and that of a friend who connected her to the teen assassins. Social media was not as ubiquitous then, but there were notes, letters, and whispered conversations that pointed to a plot forming just beneath the surface. Witnesses would later claim to have seen a teenage boy loitering near the Smart home that evening, dressed in dark clothing, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. If this was Flynn, he was making the final checks before committing the unthinkable. The timeline of the last 24 hours became crucial during the trial. Investigators pieced together surveillance footage from local convenience stores. At 7:15 p.m., a store's CCTV camera captured a teenage boy, matching Flynn's description, buying a pack of gum. The weather had shifted slightly by nightfall, a light breeze picking up, rustling the trees outside the Smart residence. Expert analysis of phone records showed a flurry of calls between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. Pamela's statements to police changed over time, first claiming ignorance, then providing partial truths. One of Gregg's friends recalled trying to call him around 7:30 p.m. to discuss weekend plans. The phone rang without answer. Investigators would later learn this was around the crucial window of opportunity the killers had chosen. As night fell, the stage was set. The normalcy of Gregg's last day, his steady work routine, his neighborly gestures, the breeze through the quiet streets, served as a cruel counterpoint to what was coming. This was the lull before the storm, an ordinary Tuesday night that would be transformed into a flashpoint of violence, leaving an innocent man dead and an entire community in disbelief. Central to this crime was William "Billy" Flynn, the teenage perpetrator who pulled the trigger. Flynn was only 16 at the time. He hailed from Seabrook, a nearby coastal town known for its power plant and summertime tourists. Flynn's family background was less stable than Gregg's. His parents struggled to maintain a cohesive family unit, resulting in a somewhat chaotic home environment. He bounced between living with different relatives at times, and while there was no glaring incident that would predict his future crime, there were subtle warning signs. Teachers from the public high school he attended described him as polite but somewhat withdrawn. He was not a standout student, hovering around average grades, though he showed some talent in shop class and mechanical tasks. He enjoyed tinkering with old bicycles and would sometimes help neighbors fix small appliances, charging a nominal fee that he saved up for buying secondhand clothes and music tapes. Flynn's social circle included a few friends who shared his interest in heavy metal music and skateboarding. The group sometimes hung out in deserted parking lots, practicing kickflips and scribbling band names on their backpacks. There are no official records of major delinquent behavior before the murder, but some neighbors recalled minor pranks or late-night mischief, harmless teenager stuff. Or so it seemed at the time. At home, disagreements between his parents often created tension. According to a family acquaintance who later gave a statement, Flynn sometimes seemed hungry for guidance, admiration, or attention, something he might have lacked in a stable, nurturing form. In terms of education, Flynn attended the same high school where Pamela Smart worked as a media coordinator. He was a sophomore who drifted through classes, not making much of a mark academically. His online presence was virtually non-existent at the time, given that the early 1990s were still the pre-internet era for most households. However, he did keep a few journals and wrote letters to friends, some of which were introduced as evidence during the trial. These revealed a restless mind, prone to romanticizing certain figures in his life. In the months leading up to the crime, Flynn's behavior began to change under the influence of Pamela Smart. She introduced him to new music, flattered his ego, and gradually pulled him into her world. Psychological profiles crafted by experts during the trial would later suggest that Flynn was impressionable, searching for identity and validation. Pamela Smart, older and more experienced, seemed glamorous to him. She stood out from the adult figures he knew. She listened to him, confided in him, made him feel special. In videotape testimony, Flynn claimed that Pamela told him repeatedly that her husband Gregg was abusive, that she was trapped and miserable. While no direct evidence corroborated these claims, they were effective enough for Flynn to rationalize what was being asked of him. Flynn had no known prior violent incidents. He did not have a juvenile record of assault or weapon possession. This made his sudden leap to murder all the more startling. Investigators and psychologists attributed this radical shift to Pamela's manipulation and a romantic ideal Flynn constructed in his head. He convinced himself that by killing Gregg, he would free Pamela and prove his love for her. This twisted logic fed into a narrative that Flynn, still psychologically malleable, embraced wholeheartedly. Before the crime, Flynn spent some time practicing with a borrowed handgun. Friends later testified that he had talked vaguely about doing something big, but never elaborated. His known behaviors included hanging out at the local arcade, smoking cigarettes, and daydreaming about running away. Yet beneath the teenage bravado, he was insecure, anxious about his looks and future. Pamela Smart offered him a vision of adulthood that was thrilling. She was older, married, and confident. That someone like her would turn to him for help must have seemed extraordinary, validating his existence in a way he had never experienced. The relationship between Flynn and Gregg Smart was indirect. Flynn knew Gregg only as the husband of the woman he was seeing. He likely viewed Gregg as an obstacle, a problem to be removed. Flynn's trial testimony provided chilling insight into his mindset. "I did it because I was told that if I loved her, I would do this. She said we'd be together after." Expert witnesses later explained this as a form of psychological grooming. Pamela identified Flynn's vulnerabilities and leveraged them. In the end, Flynn's young age and lack of prior violent behavior complicated the legal and moral narrative. Was he a mastermind or a pawn? The jury would eventually have to weigh his actions against his immaturity and manipulation by Pamela Smart. But at the moment he stepped into that condo on May 1, 1990, armed and ready to kill, all these complexities boiled down to a simple, horrific truth. He was about to end an innocent man's life. On the night of May 1, 1990, the crime unfolded with deadly efficiency. Gregg Smart, arriving home around 5:30 p.m., had no inkling of the danger lurking. The house was a modest condo, rooms neatly arranged, not the kind of place one would associate with violent crime. Sometime between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m., William Flynn and an accomplice slipped into the Smart home. According to later testimony, they entered through the unlocked front door. Flynn carried a second .38 caliber revolver. The lights inside were dim and the television murmured softly. CCTV footage from a nearby convenience store placed Flynn in the neighborhood around 7:15 p.m. Phone records indicate a call placed from Pamela Smart's location at around the same time, possibly confirming that Gregg was home and vulnerable. Weather conditions outside were mild, the streets quiet under a pale moonlight. Witnesses in neighboring homes would later recall hearing what sounded like a scuffle or a muffled argument, though no one at the time recognized it as the prelude to murder. By 9 p.m. the deed was done. Flynn confronted Gregg in the hallway near the front door. The exact timeline was reconstructed from forensic analysis and conflicting testimonies, but the consensus was that Gregg Smart was caught off guard. There were no defensive wounds on his body, suggesting he had little time to react. The single gunshot that ended Gregg's life echoed in the confined space. Physical evidence included a bullet casing found near the kitchen counter, a partial footprint near the entryway, and faint traces of gunpowder on Flynn's clothing later recovered. Crime scene photographs showed Gregg lying face down on the floor, dressed in his work slacks and a collared shirt, a tragically ordinary outfit for his final moments. The furniture was largely undisturbed, suggesting the attack was quick and targeted. No valuables were taken, and the condo was not ransacked. This indicated the motive was murder, pure and simple. After the shooting, Flynn and his accomplice fled. Records show they returned to Seabrook that night. Phone calls between Pamela Smart and the teenage conspirators would surface later, corroborating the theory that Pamela had orchestrated the murder. Forensic analysis matched the bullet to a gun that witnesses testified Flynn had shown them days prior. A neighbor's security camera picked up the sound of a car driving off around 9:15 p.m. The weather remained calm, but to the trained eye, the crime scene told a stormy story of betrayal and violence. When police arrived after Pamela reported finding her husband shot, they noted her oddly calm demeanor. Officer statements revealed that Pamela showed less emotion than expected of a grieving spouse. In the days that followed, The phone records, partial fingerprints, and testimonies from frightened teenage accomplices started to form a narrative. Gregg Smart's murder was not random. It was the final step in a cold, calculated plan. Initial evidence collection took place under bright halogen lights as investigators combed through the condo. They bagged the bullet casing, photographed shoe prints on the entry mat, and dusted for fingerprints along doorknobs and countertops. Gregg's body was removed by paramedics around midnight, and an autopsy later confirmed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. CCTV footage from nearby establishments, along with phone records and witness accounts, helped police form a partial timeline. They identified William Flynn as a suspect within days. Surveillance footage did not show the crime itself but placed Flynn in the vicinity. His known association with Pamela Smart, who became a suspect when inconsistencies emerged in her statements, connected the dots. Slowly, the puzzle pieces aligned, revealing a shocking murder-for-hire scheme orchestrated not by a hardened criminal, but by a high school media coordinator, using teenage students to kill her husband. The investigation began as soon as first responders arrived at the Smart residence, shortly after Pamela's frantic phone call. Police cordoned off the scene, preserving evidence. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as blue and red lights illuminated the street. Officers went door to door, asking if anyone saw something unusual. Many remembered seeing a strange teenage boy in the area that evening. Others recalled cars idling where they normally wouldn't. The community, now in a state of disbelief, began cooperating fully with authorities, desperate to see justice done. Forensic experts analyzed the crime scene meticulously. The bullet retrieved matched a particular type sold at local gun shops, prompting investigators to check sales records. Fingerprint lifts from the doorknob and phone were examined. Clothing fibers were collected. Although technology was not as advanced as it is today, police still had robust forensic methods at their disposal. Blood splatter patterns and the lack of signs of forced entry suggested that the killers either entered through an unlocked door or were let in by someone inside. As leads developed, detectives interviewed Pamela Smart multiple times. Initially, she wept, proclaiming her innocence in shock, but investigators noted her story changed slightly in subsequent interviews. They requested her phone records and discovered suspicious calls to Flynn's associates. This prompted them to question teenage witnesses who were close to Flynn. Under pressure, these young witnesses began to talk, weaving a tale of a secret affair between Pamela and Flynn, and a murder plot hatched in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Expert opinions were sought. A local psychologist consulted by the prosecution explained to reporters that Flynn, at 16, might have been easily manipulated by an older woman he admired. The community turned out in droves for candlelight vigils, holding photographs of Gregg and demanding answers. Media coverage soared. Newspaper headlines called it the teacher-student murder scandal, though Pamela was not a teacher but a media coordinator. Television crews camped outside the courthouse and the Smart residence, broadcasting the latest developments nationwide. As the days turned to weeks, police pieced together a solid case. They arrested Flynn and his accomplices. They arrested Pamela Smart as well, charging her with conspiracy to commit murder. The announcement was made in a televised press conference, where a police spokesman said, "We believe we have the individuals responsible for this heinous crime in custody." The community breathed a sigh of relief, but also felt a deep sadness. Nothing would bring Gregg Smart back. In court filings, prosecutors meticulously laid out the timeline. They included transcripts of phone calls, partial confessions from the teenage perpetrators, and forensic evidence linking the bullet to Flynn's gun. Witness interviews provided the emotional context. One teenager testified that Pamela talked about killing her husband like it was the only way out. Another said Flynn was head over heels and would do anything she asked. Media coverage excerpted these confessions, shocking a nation that wondered how a seemingly normal woman could orchestrate such violence through vulnerable minors. The legal proceedings that followed were highly publicized, turning the quiet town of Derry into a media circus. William Flynn was arrested first, as physical evidence and witness testimonies pointed straight to him as the gunman. Police reports mentioned the day of the arrest, June 11, 1990, at 4:30 p.m. Flynn was found at a friend's house, looking pale and nervous. Officers handcuffed him and read him his rights. Soon after, the other teenage accomplices were brought in. Pamela Smart's arrest came after a careful gathering of evidence. On August 1, 1990, she was escorted out of her workplace by officers, charged with being an accomplice to murder. The charges against the teens included first-degree murder for Flynn and his direct accomplices. Pamela Smart faced a charge of being an accomplice to first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Pre-trial hearings drew massive crowds. Defense attorneys for the teenagers argued their clients were manipulated by Pamela, who wielded emotional and sexual control over them. Expert testimonies included psychologists who detailed how minors could be coerced or influenced by adults. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused on the brutality of the act and the fact that no one forced Flynn to pull the trigger. They highlighted the victim's innocence and the callousness of robbing Gregg Smart of his life. Court sessions were held at the Rockingham County Superior Court. Each day, news vans lined the street. Inside, witnesses took the stand. William Flynn's testimony was perhaps the most anticipated. On the stand, he spoke softly, explaining how Pamela Smart had allegedly told him that Gregg was abusive and needed to be taken care of. He admitted to pulling the trigger, tears rolling down his cheeks. He delivered the now infamous quote, "I loved her, and she told me the only way to have her was to get rid of him." Pamela Smart's defense team attempted to cast doubt on the credibility of teenage testimonies, arguing that they were shifting blame to avoid harsher sentences. They painted Pamela as an innocent woman framed by troubled youths, but the prosecution produced phone records, witnesses who saw Pamela meeting with the teens in secluded places, and letters that hinted at a forbidden romance. Expert testimonies from ballistic specialists, forensic analysts, and psychologists filled the courtroom with technical detail. The pathologist who performed Gregg's autopsy described the fatal wound. The gun expert showed how the bullet matched Flynn's weapon. A handwriting analyst confirmed notes exchanged between Pamela and the teenagers. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Pamela Smart was found guilty of accomplice to first-degree murder and conspiracy, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Flynn and the other teens, tried as adults despite their young ages, were also found guilty but given the possibility of parole after many years. Sentencing took place in 1991. Flynn received a 28-year sentence, later reduced due to his cooperation. The courtroom was packed. Media coverage reached a fever pitch, with live broadcasts airing the moment the verdict was read. Appeals were filed. Pamela Smart appealed her conviction, claiming judicial bias and evidentiary issues, but the appeals were unsuccessful. Over the years, she continued to maintain her innocence from prison. Flynn eventually expressed remorse for his actions and was granted parole in 2015. But the damage was done, and no number of appeals could restore the life that was taken. The impact and aftermath of Gregg Smart's murder resonated far beyond Derry. The town struggled to move forward after such a high-profile crime. Residents who once felt safe and trusting now locked their doors more diligently. The community looked inward, trying to understand how a seemingly well-adjusted adult could convince impressionable teenagers to commit murder. PTA meetings discussed the importance of safeguarding children from predatory adults. High schools reviewed their policies, ensuring better oversight of staff interactions with students. Family statements were heart-wrenching. Gregg's parents spoke publicly about their grief, calling their son's murder a senseless tragedy. They worked with local organizations to set up a small scholarship fund in Gregg's name, hoping to keep his memory alive by helping other young people achieve their dreams. Legislative changes were proposed in New Hampshire to strengthen penalties for adults who exploit minors in the commission of crimes. While not all proposals passed, the case sparked a broader conversation about the vulnerabilities of teenagers and the responsibilities of adults who hold positions of trust. Memorial services were held annually for a time. At these gatherings, people lit candles, read poems, and remembered Gregg Smart not as a victim, but as a kind soul who had his life stolen. Photographs of him smiling, guitar in hand, circulated through the community, reminding everyone of the person he was before becoming a symbol of tragedy. The legacy of the case lingers in popular culture. Books, movies, and documentaries retold the story from various angles. Some portray Pamela Smart as a cunning manipulator. Others examine the psychological vulnerabilities of Flynn and his friends. Debate continues in comment sections of online forums and social media posts. New evidence never truly emerged to exonerate Pamela Smart or shift the narrative substantially, but the passage of time allowed for more nuanced understandings of the psychological pressures at play. In Derry, some subtle changes took hold. Neighbors became more vigilant. Schools increased training for staff on recognizing inappropriate relationships. The support systems created included counseling for students who felt uncomfortable with adult authority figures, and hotlines where teenagers could report suspicious behavior. Victim advocacy groups used Gregg Smart's case as an example, highlighting the need for early intervention when minors seem to be influenced by dangerous adults. Long-term effects included a heightened awareness of how emotional manipulation can escalate into violence. The case served as a cautionary tale. Over the years, many true crime enthusiasts and concerned parents revisited the details, using it to discuss healthy relationships, boundaries, and the importance of critical thinking in young people. Some community members formed mentorship programs to guide at-risk youth, giving them positive role models who would never lead them astray. Currently, decades later, Pamela Smart remains incarcerated, her appeals exhausted. Billy Flynn lives a quiet life after parole, maintaining a low profile. The community of Derry has largely moved on, though the memory still flickers in the collective consciousness. The scholarship fund in Gregg's memory continues to help a few students each year, ensuring that something positive endures. As we reflect on these events, let's remember the key points: a young man's life cut short, a community shaken, a sensational trial that drew national attention, and a cautionary lesson about the power of manipulation. The murder of Gregg Smart stands as a stark reminder that the quietest of towns can harbor deadly secrets, and that trust, once broken, leaves scars not easily healed. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories, and tell us in the comments what you think. Do cases like this, where a seemingly ordinary person orchestrates a crime through vulnerable teenagers, change your perspective on the safety of your own community? Also consider checking out related cases, such as the Betty Broderick and Diane Downs cases, where shocking domestic crimes also grip the public's imagination. We encourage you to join the discussion and share your thoughts on this and other complex true crime stories.